Hello, everyone. This is Volts for August 2nd, 2024. How to cram EV fast chargers into tight urban spaces. I'm your host, David Roberts. The New York City company Revel began life as the owner and operator of an electric moped rideshare network. But it kept running into trouble finding reliable fast charging in the urban environments where it operated. When it looked into the urban charger business, it found a classic chicken and egg problem. No one would make the substantial upfront investments to build urban fast chargers without sufficient demand. At the same time, few urban consumers or fleets were willing to bet on EVs without sufficient charging infrastructure. Who goes first? Revel has come up with a distinctive answer. Build the chargers and demand for the chargers at the same time. So it shifted from mopeds to cars, developing a rideshare network in which all drivers drive EVs and all the EVs charge at Revel facilities. It is the chicken and the egg. Revel has begun building a network of urban fast chargers in New York City, and along the way it has done a good deal of thinking about where to locate them, how to operate them, and how to expand the model beyond New York. Today I'm excited to talk to Tobias Lescht, head of EV charging infrastructure for Revel, about what the company has learned, the role of urban fast charging, and the prospects for more cities getting these chargers. Okay then, without further ado, Tobias Lescht of Revel, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
So, just to orient people a little bit, I want you to start by just talking briefly a little bit about the history of the company, because there are twists and turns involved. The company has pivoted and is doing a couple of different things. So maybe just briefly tell the story of where you started and where you are now.
Yeah, definitely. Revel has lots of twists and turns in its history, and it's pretty amazing that we've ended up where we are now. I don't think that was premeditated, but sometimes we like to say it was because it sounds like a good story. But anyways, so Revel started in 2018 as a electric moped company in Brooklyn, New York, and the co-founders scraped every dollar and cent they could together from friends, family, themselves, and basically bought 68 mopeds and launched them in Brooklyn. And it really just took off. And so a year later, they then raised some more money and then bought 1,000 mopeds and put them on the road in Brooklyn. And that's really where I joined the company, was about a year after it started. And then from there, we were launching in DC, Austin, Oakland, San Francisco. We really tried to scale it up, and it was going really well, and COVID hit, and that was pretty hard for a micromobility platform that required you to share helmets, as you can imagine. So
I didn't even think of that aspect.
The stats from before COVID to COVID went to zero, but then even after a lot of the restrictions were lifted, people just changed the way that they did things. So
interesting. I would almost think that trying to avoid subway cars or trying to avoid crowded public transit would send more people to an individual.
And that did definitely happen in New York. So summer of 2020 was absolutely crazy because no one was taking the subway.
Right.
People were not taking Uber and Lyfts. So really the only way to get around New York was on these mopeds. So we were doing 100,000 miles a day. And I was kind of in charge of making sure that operation worked at scale. And it was pretty awesome. I mean, we really had that thing humming. And then there was a few incidents later. And even during that summer, we had really decided that the moped business was great. It was super fun. Definitely the most fun I've ever had in a job. But it wasn't super scalable, and it only really worked in 2 cities in America, San Francisco and New York, where you have the density.
Interesting. Is that because of density or something else, something cultural?
I think a bit of both. It's density, car ownership is a big component of it. There's also just the cultural piece Anyway, so it's just not something that we could really expand to a lot more cities. And then even in those markets, there's only a certain number of people who are willing to go get on a moped, I guess.
Yeah.
It isn't like Milan or Paris or, somewhere else where everyone's riding around, or Vietnam, everyone, that's the only way to get around. So yeah, it was a really fun business, but honestly, we just decided that we needed to get into four wheels, and there was so much going on with electrification at that time. Mm-hmm. We just had so many tailwinds there that's really where we wanted to focus. So essentially, I came over with one of the co-founders of the company, and we sat in the basement of our office all through COVID trying to plan out how we would launch a rideshare service in New York that was all electric. And that was really interesting time because we essentially didn't know anything about charging. Zero. Mm. We were looking up, Googling, what's an L2? What's a DC fast charger? But then we got through that, and we were thinking, how are we going to charge? At that time, we wanted to buy about 50 EVs. How are we going to charge those in New York? And there was no infrastructure. It didn't exist. So we thought about installing level 2s, the pros and cons of that.
Public level 2s, you mean? That's what you were thinking about? Like
just for our fleet. We honestly were just thinking, how do we charge our fleet? Mm. So we kind of had this, light bulb moment when we realized, why is there no fast charging infrastructure in New York? Because with a rideshare fleet, you could try to do it with level 2s, but it's really hard to basically get through a duty cycle in a day with one charge on these vehicles. Mm. So we knew we needed some DCFC, and there just didn't exist. I mean, outside of some Tesla stations, which have pay to park to get in, there's like one site at the airport. There really wasn't anything out there in the whole of New York City, which is the biggest city in America. So
fast charging, level 3 specifically.
Level 3 fast charging. And then level 2, I mean, everything is in a parking garage. You have one or two chargers. So You can't run a fleet off that at all. And that wasn't something that was scalable for us. So we looked at the level 2, level 3, realized that there's a chicken and egg problem. The reason there's no fast charging in New York City, at least a few years ago, is because there's no EVs in New York City. There's very few. I think there's like 10,000 EVs in the entire New York City area, which is not many.
So this is the famous chicken and egg problem that everybody's having right now. That's afflicting all cities everywhere, which is no one wants to invest to build the chargers until there's enough cars to demand them, to utilize them, to make them pay off. But no one wants to get the cars until there's enough charging to support them. And so this is the standoff we're in everywhere right now.
Definitely. It's everywhere. And most acute in the densest urban areas where the cost of real estate is the highest and the cost to install is the highest.
Right.
And, the first wave of people who bought EVs had garages and access to home charging. And then they would use fast chargers, infrequently, but sometimes. But because there's enough people who had, say in California, had access to their garage to charge overnight, it kind of let some of these fast charging stations actually get built. Kind of wasn't as big of a chicken and egg problem. But New York City, no one has garages. None of the garages really had L2s in them at all. So there was like no way to own an EV in New York. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So we decided, okay, this is not just a rideshare play where we're going to put cars on the road and drive them and charge them at our own sites. We wanted to break that chicken and egg problem by providing the demand that was needed to build these large, fast charging stations in urban environments and do that with our fleet. And most of the time our fleet was charging overnight. So it was this really great complementary duty cycle that allowed members of the public to come charge during the daytime and us use a site mostly overnight, but allowed us to build out this large scale infrastructure that otherwise wasn't economically possible.
Right. So this is the big insight this is how you break the chicken and egg problem is you produce the chicken and the egg, basically.
Yeah. At the same time.
You make the chargers and you make the demand for chargers via your own rideshare company. This was the big insight.
This was it. Yeah. So this was like, two guys in a basement coming up with this idea. And then essentially we went out and looked for sites and then we're like, oh man, there's no power. I mean, we knew this when we were looking at moped locations to run our mopeds out of, is we needed some power to charge those batteries, albeit, 600 amps or 800 amps of power. We thought that was a huge amount of power.
Right. And when you say power, you mean just like utility capacity, basically. Like,
yeah, because that's the big problem in urban environments. I mean, it's across the entire country, but interconnecting with the utility is very, very difficult and takes a long time. You're talking 2 years.
I want to just probe a little bit here at the beginning about the relationship between the rideshare and the chargers. Would you say at this point in the company's evolution that chargers are the main thing now, the main revenue generator, the center of the business? Like, have you pivoted that far?
I'm on the charging side of Revel, so I'm a little biased. It's definitely not the main revenue source for the company at the moment. Rideshare creates more revenue. But if I think about scalability, applicability to multiple markets, and you think about the future of Revel, the rideshare business is great. It's doing really well. But I think that infrastructure is definitely the primary focus for us.
Let's talk a little bit about the deal with Uber, because the alternative to having your own rideshare company that uses your chargers is there are existing rideshare companies out there, and they are making concerted efforts to electrify. So theoretically, like if you're going to a new place that's not New York City, a new town, and you could just make a deal with existing rideshare drivers to use your chargers, could you then just abandon the rideshare half of this and devote yourself to chargers? Like, do you see that as the kind of telos, the end that you're heading toward? Or do you think rideshare is going to be half the equation everywhere you go? I hope that question made sense.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think one of the things that we've realized after operating the rideshare business for a couple of years and the charging business for a couple of years. So just rewind about a year ago, the charging business really was not a real business. We were having maybe 30, 40 people show up every day. I mean, it was, tens of thousands in revenue. We've way over tenfolded that in the last year due to a couple things that happened in New York City. One is the TLC basically limits the number of Uber and Lyft vehicles on the road through licenses.
What is the TLC?
The Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York City is the regulator.
Quite powerful in New York.
Very
perhaps
powerful.
More so than in other cities. They're old and they've been around.
Yeah, and similar to, you hear about, medallions for yellow cabs. They have a diamond system for black cabs, which is essentially Uber and Lyft vehicles. So that had been capped at a certain number of vehicles. But last fall, they opened that up again and issued 12,000 new licenses, all EVs. And since so many of these Uber and Lyft drivers were just desperate to drive their own vehicle, not rent from a fleet operator, they all went and purchased EVs. So we went from having basically no revenue, no real business. It was great. We were providing a service. People could charge there. We had really loyal customers. It was great, but went from tenfold that business basically overnight to the point where now it's a multi-million-dollar revenue business in New York, and we have 3 public sites open.
Note for listeners that the Limousine Commission did not issue all those EV licenses out of the goodness of their heart, right? It's a new law in New York City, is it not?
Exactly. So this is the Green Rides Initiative, and essentially by 2030, all Uber Lyft trips have to be electric. And this is part of their way to kickstart that. And we really look forward to, how seeing that progress over time. But 2030, people used to think that was a long time ago. We're talking 5.5 years.
I know.
So it's crazy fast.
Don't remind me, man. It's coming right up. So in other words, the New York City rideshare fleet is rapidly electrifying, thus providing a tenfold. I saw the little graph on your website. It's remarkable, like literally a tenfold increase in the use of your fast chargers overnight as all these new EVs came online. So this gets me back to my question. Like, do you still need your own rideshare company in New York City if all the other rideshare companies are going electric and using your chargers and you're making most of your money now off the chargers? Do you still need your own rideshare company in New York City?
From a charging perspective, we don't. We can be profitable without our rideshare fleet. That being said, the rideshare fleet is doing really well, so we have no plans to abandon that at all. That's great. What may happen is that these businesses become somewhat bifurcated versus attached at the hip. But, that's not really for me to comment on too much. But I will say that, yeah, we can be profitable without our own rideshare business providing. Previously it was 80% of the utilization of the sites, and now we're way less than half. So that's so cool to see that there's now other sources of demand that we can rely on to then go build out more charging that's not attached to our own fleet expansion plans. Because one of the things that's hard is scaling the rideshare business quickly.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking all these questions is just that, like, running a rideshare business seems to me like, I don't know, from the inside, but just from the outside, it looks like hard, like a lot of soft costs, a lot of hassle, maintenance, dealing with drivers, and everything else. It's just a lot to take on. Whereas just like building infrastructure and running it seems a little bit simpler. So
I won't say infrastructure is simple, but rideshare is very hard.
Yeah.
Infrastructure is very hard. Doing both of those at the same time really well is even harder. So just to close out your question there, these two things are going to exist, maybe independently from each other, maybe not. But our plans on the infrastructure side of the business don't rely on our rideshare expansion. And we're looking at other cities to go to, imminently. We have leases signed in San Francisco, LA, Chicago are places we're looking at right now. So we're moving really quickly in terms of fast charging development in urban centers. And that is entirely based off of basically other rideshare sources that are not Revel being able to provide that demand.
Can you make it work in a new city without your own rideshare company and without a mandate like New York's? Right? Because now you don't necessarily need your own rideshare in New York City because all the other rideshares are electrifying, but there's no such mandate in San Francisco. Could you make it work in the absence of that mandate?
Yeah. So in California, they actually have a rule on the books that wants 90% of all Uber and Lyft rides to be electric by 2030. So there is legislation that actually is going to push us along. But, outside of the legislation, Uber has committed itself to 100% electric by 2030. Lyft has done something similar. We see, adoption in places like Chicago, which is a very cold, hard place to own an EV, actually go pretty well. So we're very bullish on these large urban centers actually transitioning to electric Uber and Lyft's TNCs, as well as we do think that legislation similar to what has been pretty successful in New York over the last year are likely to happen in these other cities as well.
Oh, you think other cities are going to follow New York's lead on this?
I would imagine. You can't say for 100% certainty, but they have been really successful in doing this. That I expect that other cities with the same kind of political leaning are going to try to copy it. Maybe not exactly the same way, but they've seen that there is carrots and sticks that really can push the electrification of these TNC miles along. And one of the things that, still blows my mind is how many miles are traveled every day by these TNC vehicles.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy. There's 100,000 vehicles in New York that are yellow cab TNC. I think it's even over 100,000. They do about 75 miles a day. And that includes, that's an average over the year. So some days are not doing any. So on the days they're actually driving around, it's more than that. And if you think about how many miles that is a day, 7.5 million miles a day in New York City alone that is being done by these TNC fleets. Now look at all the other cities in America.
Yeah.
It's on a scale that's massive.
These are the super drivers, gets back to the subject of a pod I did a long time ago, which is that, driving sort of like everything else kind of follows the 80-20 rule, which is that it's a relatively small number of drivers that drive a wildly disproportionate number of the miles. And people are always talking how about we should focus policy on those drivers. And this seems like exactly that.
Totally. And the turnover of these vehicles is much faster. So someone who buys a gas car in 2019 probably looking for a new vehicle now because, they put over 200,000 miles on that vehicle already doing TNC work.
Just curious, are the cab companies electrifying at all? Or are they the caboose of this train? What about yellow cabs themselves?
I have to be careful with what I say there, but yeah, they're probably following behind. Most of the regulations are focused on TNCs, which is technology networked companies like Uber, Lyft, and all the other ones there. So they'll fall a little bit behind. Part of it's also in New York City, like Manhattan is where all the yellow cabs are. And there's even less charging in Manhattan because it's so hard to develop there. So they need a lot more charging built out before they can really transition.
Interesting. And so the idea is you build the chargers, rideshare provides the initial demand, but then you also offer them to the public. So the public gets access to charging as kind of a side benefit of this core business.
Yeah, this is the beautiful part about it is, again, we're solving this chicken and egg problem, but instead of using our own fleet necessarily to do that, we now have all these other rideshare vehicles that are out there that can scale up a lot faster than we can. And that means that once these, they're providing right now 80% of the utilization for our sites, which is awesome. But over time,
20% is public.
Yeah. So over time, we expect that to kind of switch, and we expect, 60% or so coming from the public.
Oh, really?
40% from TNCs. Yeah, it's still obviously a high number from TNCs, but over time, as you get full electrification, and when I say public, it could be other fleets, individual mom and pops that own vehicles like a van that they need to charge at.
Right.
So there's a whole public is a big category, and then we have rideshare vehicles, which is, called the anchor tenant for our sites.
Right. I want to talk about the chargers themselves a little bit. First, just for listeners' benefit, we are talking here about level 3 chargers. So level 1, just so everybody knows, level 1 is like the plug in your house, very low power, low voltage. Level 2 is kind of what you can get in your garage when you buy your EV. It's a little faster. And then there's level 3, which is sort of orders of magnitude faster than both those. But level 2 can kind of go in quickly and kind of go in anywhere. It can go on a light pole, it can go on a curb, it can go whatever. Level 3, then you're talking about more serious electricity infrastructure here. You're talking about pretty high-powered installations here. So I have a couple of questions. Just sort of, what do these look like? If I don't live in New York, like, is this like a gas station setup? Is it a parking lot somewhere? Or is it a building I drive into? What are these, like literally, what do these chargers look like?
It is all of the above. So a lot of the sites we're developing are in old parking lots that we then lease and basically build out these level 3 fast charging super hubs, we like to call them. Our first site was 25 of these fast chargers in a parking lot. And then you pull up to it. It looks like a gas pump. You interact with it pretty similar to a gas pump. You tap your credit card, plug in, and then you charge. Some of them we've built in parking garages where we're, again, leasing space. We've built 2 other parking garage sites. A future one, we actually took down a whole gas station and we are renovating that entire space and making it electric-only gas station. So when you think about it, it's really gas stations of the future is what we're working on.
Yeah, part of what I was wondering is whether you're sort of building alongside the chargers stuff for people to do while they're sitting there for 20 or 30 minutes. Are you trying to build sort of like destinations, or do you think when it's fast charging, just the charger is enough?
That's one of the biggest focuses internally that we're trying to develop a really cohesive strategy around. Right now, we're trying a bunch of things out. I think when we first started, it was put chargers in the ground where there's enough of them that someone can find a reliable charge and make sure that those chargers work. That's table stakes.
Yeah.
And that is something that the industry...
Not something you can take for granted these days if you're driving an EV.
I think we've done a really good job of executing on that. So again, outside of Tesla, we have the biggest site in the United States. And we built that in 2021 and no one's still past that. And then that was 25 stalls. Next year, we're building a 60 stall site in Maspeth, Queens in New York, and a 48 stall site right by LGA Airport, LaGuardia Airport.
Oh, interesting.
So we're building these mega sites because if you think about the number of visits that you get to a typical gas station and the amount of fill-ups, you need 30 stalls, 25 stalls to even compare to a small gas station. To a big gas station, you need 60 because it takes longer.
Yeah.
So when you think about the customer experience, how terrible as an experience it is when you show up to a 4-stall site, 2 of the stalls are broken, and then the other 2 are occupied. And then you wait. But if you have 25, if 2 are broken, again, we want to have 100% uptime. But if 2 are broken, it's okay. There's going to be a stall available. Even if every stall is taken, it turns over really quickly. So our queuing when we've had queuing on certain days have been super busy, people are waiting 5 minutes. They're not waiting an hour to charge, which is really important for making sure that the customer knows they can get a reliable charge. You don't want to show up and then run out of juice because you couldn't get to the charger.
So you're trying to build out ahead of demand, basically. Make sure that you sort of have demand plus.
Exactly.
You have a little surplus.
And I think we've been successful in that. And that goes back to the Uber deal that we signed earlier this year, where they are guaranteeing us, a certain level of utilization for these sites. In return, we're providing their drivers a discount. But they're not doing that in the hope that we're building out charging stations, doing it because we already have them open. And I think a lot of this industry has been plagued by promises that have not been fulfilled.
Yeah.
So people say, hey, we're going to build all these amazing sites, and then it doesn't happen. So we're really trying to put, the sites in and say, hey, look at this massive site we have. We want demand, and they want to guarantee it.
Just to be clear here with the Uber deal, the idea is Uber drivers will use your chargers instead of alternative chargers? Like they sort of pledge to charge X amount in a week? Or what is you're giving Uber drivers a 25% discount on the price of charging in exchange for what exactly? What exactly are they promising?
The individual drivers do not have to promise anything. They can charge wherever they like. We are confident that they're going to charge at our sites because they're the biggest, best, fastest, and cheapest. So that's a pretty compelling offering to those drivers. Uber agrees with us and therefore is willing to put their money where their mouth is, if you want to say it that way, and actually guarantee that 15% of the utilization from our sites is actually coming from their drivers because of the discounts.
So this is not like a mandate on individual drivers. This is just something they feel confident predicting is going to play out. And they'll pay you if it doesn't.
Exactly. So then that gives us enough confidence to go build out more big sites like this because we're sure that we're going to have demand, or we're guaranteed demand actually. So from a business perspective, it offloads a lot of the risk of building out these massive projects. And they are really massive projects, and they take multiple years and millions of dollars of capital to get done.
Yeah. Kind of a side question, but this came up in my discussion about public charging a few weeks ago. Are you designing the chargers themselves, or is this, or are the chargers themselves sort of commodified enough at this point that you're just sort of buying off the shelf? Are there design features of the actual chargers themselves that set them apart from other chargers, or is it just like a level 3 charger is a level 3 charger?
I can geek out on this for hours, but the answer is we do not design or manufacture chargers ourselves. That is a very hard problem, and we already focused on enough hard problems.
You have a lot of hard problems on your plate already.
Tesla's vertically integrated. They're also a massive company, so they've been really successful in having that vertically integrated setup where they design, and that is one of the reasons they've been super successful, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. But there's a lot of other companies out there that produce chargers. We've been using Tritium for a while. They just went bankrupt, so we've been looking for new options as well. And, the next site we open in New York is not going to have Tritium chargers. It's actually going to have ChemPower chargers. They're a Finnish company. And one thing that we like about them, as well as others like SK Signet, is that they're building a distributed power sharing setup within their chargers. So essentially you have a rectifier cabinet which takes the AC power from the grid and turns it into DC power at a large scale. So these cabinets are 600 kilowatts of power, and then it sends it to 6 or so actual charging stalls posts. So you basically get 100 kW per post if everyone's plugged in at one time, but we can go up to 320 kW per post.
So a little bit of intelligence there. It's like power management.
Exactly. And this is different from other competitors in the market that build what I like to call all-in-one chargers. So, a company like Electrify America, they go out and put in a 350 kW all-in-one charger. And that's great. You're never going to use all that power, but it requires a lot of upstream infrastructure that becomes very expensive and very hard to build these large sites that we are building.
Because then you're dealing with peaks, right? Then you're managing around peaks. You have to, if you put in a 350 kW charger, you have to have the electricity infrastructure and the capacity to deliver 350 kW, even if it's the case that that's never actually going to happen in practice. Whereas if you put a little management in, you can shave your peak, basically, I'm guessing.
Right. And one of the things, again, about back to the chargers we're choosing is that is done by hardware. So a lot of utilities, so you say, hey, I want to put in 10 350 kW chargers. They'll say, okay, you need 3.5 megawatts of grid connection.
Right.
And you're never going to use that because not all the cars charge at 350. And the ones that do charge...
Certainly not 10 at once.
Absolutely not. And they maybe do it for 5 minutes of their charge cycle, and then they go slower. So, we have this 25 stall site in Brooklyn. Our peaks are like a megawatt. And it's 25 stalls. So you think, look, obviously cars are going to get faster and that's going to go up over time, which is why we're putting in faster and faster chargers. But it really limits the size of the sites you can build. And this is something Tesla really pioneered way back in the day, is that they built these distributed architecture
interesting
systems. And that's why their sites are so big. And they don't need massive utility connections.
And so utilities are, to some extent, familiar with this and trust this, right? Because I imagine that they want some assurances that you're not going to overtax, a particular spot.
Yeah, totally. And this is a big question for utilities that they've had, is they don't necessarily trust software-based management of the loads. But some are getting more comfortable with that. Like PG&E is launching a new program, which we are enrolling some of our sites in, which essentially allows certain times of the day, hey, the grid is more constrained. And therefore, if you want to build a site here, you're going to have to wait 4 or 5 years so we can upgrade that line. But actually now we can just tell you, hey, reduce your load during this hour that maybe happens once a year. And you can have a site today. So we have a site that we're actually building in PG territory where they said you could have less than a megawatt today, but we need 3.5 megawatts to make that site work. And then we got this load study back from them that said, okay, if you manage your power, I think it's like 1 or 2 hours of the year, you can have all that power today.
Amazing.
We're like, wow, this is amazing. This unlocks infrastructure for us that we couldn't have before. We would have to wait 3 or 4 years. So that's a cool program. But back to the actual chargers that we're installing, the hardware is limited. So there's no way that the cabinet 600 kW and then each of the posts can go up to 320. There's no way that it could pull more than 600 kW off the grid. So the utilities are very comfortable with that. That's just very basic for them. So that's one of the things we're doing that I think is innovative in the industry, outside of Tesla, of course, which has done really cool things with their vertically integrated system.
It's cool that you're doing this, but it is there's no other option, right? You can't electrify the entire vehicle fleet and install these chargers without power management. You're just going to crush every grid everywhere. When you get up into the hundreds of thousands of EVs, you got to manage this or you're screwed. It's good that you're doing it on the front end. Just out of curiosity, is there a vandalism problem? Because I hear this about Seattle fast chargers all the time. That sort of half of them at any given moment are broken or have been cut, or somebody stole the copper out of them or spray painted, whatever. Is this something that's on your mind a lot?
Definitely on our mind. We have never had a vandalism problem at our site.
Interesting.
With the one exception, somebody got mad at the credit card reader and punched it potentially, and it cracked the screen. But part of this, it's so busy. So we've had our fleet there. We do think about this when we're opening up sites that don't have any of our fleet presence, maybe are going to take a little bit more time to ramp up. What we can do there is definitely a challenge. I will say we have recycled our cables before. They are less than $20 in value per cable. So anybody who thinks they're going to go cut these cables and make a lot of money off it, I hope everyone listens to this. It's not worth your time and effort. There's not very much copper in there. It's very, very low value. So I hope everyone hears that who's thinking about cutting cables. But I think people think these things have massive amounts of copper in them and they're worth, hundreds of dollars or not.
I do think it's interesting, though, the strategy of just eyes on the street. Just having lots of people around is sort of an anti-vandalism strategy in and of itself. Just having high utilization.
Yeah. And you get that from having bigger sites. So if you have a 4-stall site somewhere, people don't want to go to that because they're not sure that it's going to be free.
Right.
So then there's these 4 stalls that are in the back of a parking lot and somebody can just go by and cut. But if I have a 60-stall site, I can guarantee that there's people there pretty much 24/7.
What's your smallest site?
That we have open right now is 15 stalls.
15. Do you know enough now to have kind of a lower bound like the minimum number to make a site viable?
We really try to stay above 10, but there will be some sites that we develop in the future that are maybe 8 because that's what we could fit on that location. We really like that location, but that we really go, our sweet spot's 15 to 30.
And so when you're looking for new spots, because you're in the midst of you've got a bunch of sites in the pipeline now. You're got big expansion plans, not only in New York City, in several cities, building these big charging installations. So as you are going to whatever, San Francisco, and looking for sites, what are you looking for? Is it mainly electricity infrastructure? Is it mainly power, or are there other kind of desiderata? Are there other things you're looking for in a site? I mean, obviously traffic, I guess, being in a place where there are lots of cars, but what are you looking for in a site? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. What are you looking for in a site?
Location, number one, needs to be near a demand source. So airports, big roads, areas with high rideshare demand, areas where drivers live, which is a interesting piece of why we think that this rideshare first kind of strategy is really cool. So you're actually building these in places where rideshare drivers live, and then set very close to location is access to power. And that's kind of like the secret sauce, I would say, of acquisition of sites is where is there power? Where can you bring the power in? How do you work with utility to get as much information? How do you do this quickly where you can take a look at a site and throw it away if it doesn't work, instead of spending months on it and then finding out it doesn't work? So we've been trying to perfect that. It's super hard. A lot of these utilities have maps online that are not super updated. They try to hide that information because it's critical infrastructure. They don't want people to mess with it. So that is the hardest thing.
Dealing with utilities specifically?
The utilities have actually really improved. And, I think maybe 5 years ago, a lot of the complaints, at least the ones that we work with, were super valid. But all of these utilities have really got their act together. So Con Ed in New York is an incredible partner for us. They've set up a whole EV team, and they really just streamlined the process. I'm not going to say everything's perfect. It's not. It's a big company, but they've been a really good partner in basically helping us through the web of what needs to happen to get a site energized. To put it in perspective, we're essentially taking the amount of power you put in a skyscraper in Manhattan and putting it in a parking lot. And so we come to them and say, hey, we want this much power. Like, what? And we want it, by the way, we want it in a year. This is something that they're not used to, because they're used to bringing this much power into a development that takes 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 years.
Right.
So they are not the problem when you're building a skyscraper. Con Ed is yeah, check the box. They'll bring you the power in time. But when you're building an EV charging site, well, actually, that's the main reason that it takes so long, is there's so much that has to happen to get that much power, and it is so expensive. I think people kind of think that there's just genies working behind the plug and it just happens automatically, but getting that much power, or any power, and digging up the roads and building the infrastructure, it's a lot of work. It's not something that just happens.
Does the utility pay for that, or do you have to pay for that new infrastructure for your parking lot?
Depends on the utility. So every single utility will be different. So in New York, Con Ed would pay for it normally, but there's also now a new make ready incentive, which is an amazing local incentive for us, which helps with our customer side cost. But then also say I wanted the utility connection around the block instead of the cheapest place for Con Ed, it will pay for that. So for example, we're building a site where we have to pay them $1 million to move the utility line because that's where it makes sense for the site. The make ready can help pay for that. In San Francisco, PG&E, and any actually investor-owned utility in California, there's Rule 20, I think Rule 29 is the name of it. All EV interconnections up until 2025 are covered by the utility. And that's new.
Oh, that's a law.
Yeah, it's a law.
In California. Interesting.
And that's investor-owned utilities only. So in LA, there's Southern California Edison, which is an investor-owned utility. But then there's LADWP, which is
right.
city-owned utility.
Oh, how fun.
Those you pay for the integration. You pay for it there. So if you look at LA, most of the charging sites are in Southern California Edison territory because that is a free interconnection and it's a little easier than the city-owned utility. But we are like, okay, we're going to build the best sites in the best location. So we're working a lot with LADWP and they've been pretty good to work with so far. But anyways, it's different all across the country. Any other city you go to, I can't comment on it, but it depends on the location.
So this all sounds hella expensive. Everything you're doing, like fiddling with infrastructure, securing a site, digging up, installing, maintenance, running. How much, like what level of utilization do you need to sort of ensure payback of all that upfront investment? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so a cheap site, relatively cheap site to build with a decent rent, maybe you need 10 sessions a day per stall. I like to think of it in that term instead of utilization, because utilization is just time, and that makes a lot of sense for level twos, but we care about kilowatt hours because we sell kilowatt hours. But essentially 10 sessions per day per stall. And if you wanted to convert that to utilization, it's 25, 30% utilization.
Interesting.
A more expensive site may require higher.
Right.
So that's the key, is how do you find the sites that are cheapest to build and cheapest to rent? And that's like not an easy thing. And, the cost to build these chargers can range from industry best installation around 20 to 30,000 per post or per stall. That's like the Teslas of the world. And that's, where we're headed. And then there's the non-Tesla world where some of the other big players spend $100,000 to install a charger. And that's partly because they're building 4-stall sites, so it's more expensive. But also, there's a lot of things that Tesla's done in an incredible way. Their team is really amazing at keeping costs down and building at scale. And that's one thing that we're really focused on too, and we're doing is when you're building 10 sites in the one city, you get a lot better pricing from local contractors. You get a lot better at working with utilities, at working with the Department of Buildings. So
you can see how costs could come down over time. This.
Versus building a nationwide network, that's really hard because every site is a different beast and it's only 4 stalls. It's going to be really expensive. So scale is important in this business.
Do you worry at all about eating your own lunch? Like the more stations you install, does that have the kind of perverse effect of lowering the utilization rate at a particular station? Or do you think demand is going to be out ahead of you no matter what?
I'm not worried about demand. We've built more stations and it just gets busier. If you think about, again, just the TNC, the Uber lifts in New York City alone, we're talking about 1 billion kilowatt hours a year in 2030. It's hard to even understand how much that is, but that's $500 million business if you're charging 50 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this directly. So I want 3 numbers from you. One is, how many sites are you building in New York City currently? And then I want to know how many would be needed if the entire New York City rideshare fleet electrified. And then I want to know how many would be needed if all passenger vehicles in New York City electrified. I just want to get a sense of this kind of the scale of where we are versus what will eventually be needed.
Really hard question to answer, but I'll start with the easy one, is how much we're building. Currently, we have 54 publicly available stalls in New York City. This time next year, we'll have 200.
Oh, wow.
And then call it another year from there, we'll have 500. So we're building very quickly. how many stalls are required for full electrification of rideshare in New York City. NREL has done a study on this, and I can send you the link, David, later that you can share with the audience, but it's somewhere about 1,000 stalls only if they were used by rideshare in New York City. So that means no one else is using them. It's only for rideshare.
Right. So in a couple of years, you'll be halfway to that benchmark.
But we have users from the public using it. So that number, when you include all the other use cases, I've seen 10,000 stall estimate from the ICCT.
Oh, interesting.
So that number gets massive. And that's why, you could ask me about curbside charging, level 2s, all the above. Like, if you want to go full electrification, you need everything. And what we're focused on is that gas station experience, which is really important for the rideshare drivers because they drive so many miles, but also members of the public, like, you may not find that curbside charger you need to charge at overnight. So just go charge at one of our stations. So it's all of the above is the answer, because building 10,000 fast chargers in New York is not going to happen.
Well, I was going to say 10,000 fast chargers just to do rideshare. And then you think about all the other cars in New York, like that's...
So it's 1,000 just for rideshare.
This charging problem is mind-boggling, I think, in a way that people don't necessarily appreciate. Like the amount of infrastructure that's going to be needed just to electrify all the vehicles in New York City is just so much.
This is another thing I think about quite a bit is, and it's hard to wrap your head around, but if you take one gas pump, how many fast chargers is that due to the amount of energy that you're putting into the car in miles? Because gas is an incredibly dense energy source. So it's about 30 to 40. If you think about how fast you can pump a tank of gas into your car, which is how long it takes to charge. So hopefully that gets faster, but 30 to 40. So if you see a 4-stall gas pump, I mean, the amount of stalls you need to replicate that exact infrastructure is pretty crazy.
That is wild. Kind of makes you wonder how we're going to do this. How we're going to electrify all the vehicles.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Tell me a little bit about Tesla, because listeners who are paying attention to these matters will recall that Tesla somewhat abruptly just jettisoned its entire charging team a few months ago. I think I sort of belatedly hired a few people back, but this means a bunch of Tesla charging talent is floating around, and also means, I think, that a bunch of Tesla sites for chargers that were in development are now up for grabs. So to talk us through, sort of from Revel's perspective, the implications of Tesla's very mysterious, inexplicable move.
We took advantage of it. I'll be transparent. The people who build Tesla charging sites have the best experience in the industry, and they're the best at what they do. And finding those people prior to what happened earlier this year was really, really hard.
Right, because Tesla had, I guess, snapped them all up, right?
Yeah, they had the best people, and that was a big opportunity for us. We hired a bunch of ex-Tesla people, specifically the ones who know how to build out these sites and do construction. And they were making a huge difference on our team already, and just making these timelines shorter, reducing our costs, just having that 6 or 7 years experience building fast charging stations. That's really invaluable. So we took a lot of advantage there. I think Tesla, they fired everyone, and I think they're hiring a lot of people back who they realized they needed to retain this program more than they had originally planned. So a lot of the sites they had jettisoned and people that they had fired are now back, and they're back, I guess is what I'd say. That being said, we've looked at a lot of the sites that they were working on that maybe were not signed yet, and we were able to basically take advantage of that. But they're back, which is good for the industry, honestly. It was a big opportunity for us to be the only player in New York City, but we're happy to have a competitor. I can't tell you why Tesla did that. The only thing that I can think of is that, this is an expensive business in terms of capital deployment, and it's not a super high return business. You're not going to be, if you make 20% returns, that's a great site. Like, it's not like AI or all the other stuff they're working on.
Well, let me ask you this. Like, the way you're making it work is through this rideshare trick. You're sort of creating your own demand.
Yeah.
How's Tesla making it work? Like, how are they making any money?
Well, it's pretty similar. They sold a bunch of cars and built the chargers, and that was a chicken and egg for them.
I guess Teslas themselves are kind of their equivalent of the rideshare fleet.
Exactly. They did so we kind of copied them in some ways. Their sites are always the busiest because they have this integration with the sales of the vehicle.
Yeah, interesting. One thing I wanted to ask about, which you alluded to briefly before, but I'm super intrigued by. So, if you guys are 2 years from now running and maintaining 500 fast charging stalls, you are going to have your hands on a lot of power. And I'm wondering if there are any plans or ideas afoot to kind of do a virtual power plant play where you can start responding to grid signals and maybe either distributing power differently around your sites or just shutting some sites down temporarily in times of congestion, or even having some of your rideshare fleet feed power back into the grid, do a vehicle to grid type of thing. I mean, if anybody has sort of a laboratory where they could make that work, it's you guys. You have the chargers, you have the vehicles, you have the sites. How big a role is this virtual power plant family of things playing in your thinking right now?
This is the probably most exciting part of our business, is the opportunities that building out this large fleet of fast chargers in urban environments where the most valuable virtual power plant signals exist. So what we've done so far, because I like talking about what we've done versus what we're going to do. We actually did a vehicle to grid pilot at one of our sites in Brooklyn. We had 3 vehicle to grid chargers there, and we had that dispatching every day during the summer. That was awesome. It was cool to test the technology. The interconnection with Con Ed was interesting. They'd never done one before. So that was always a fun process, but we got that done.
What about the money, Tobias? Did you make any money on it?
Yeah, so each vehicle made about $5,000 that summer, which is cool. What I'd say is that the incentives need to be aligned better, because essentially the grid and Con Ed just think of us as a stationary battery. And a stationary battery has no opportunity cost. It sits there all year round. But what we really need to focus on is, hey, what are the 5 or 6 days where the grid is most strained? Because that's where vehicle to grid makes the most sense in an urban environment. Is, for example, there's a demand response program in New York, which we also are taking advantage of this summer. So essentially, this week we had about 3 times where it's been really hot in New York. Con Ed says, hey, we want everyone to reduce load. And we, through software load management, reduce the peak power of our sites. So people could still go there and charge. This might take a little bit longer. And therefore, Con Ed then gives us a check at the end of the summer saying, hey, you respond to grid signals and you reduce load. That is awesome. And that is something we're going to roll out next year at all of our sites. We did a test this year.
Just to probe that a little bit, one sort of intuitive take on this is just like rideshare vehicles in particular prize time. You know what I mean? Like how much demand can you move around? Do you know what I mean? Like what percentage of the power involved is really flexible? I mean, I'm sure you don't know yet on any sort of large scale, but do you have any sense of that?
I think time is really important to these drivers, and cost is really important to these drivers, and maybe more important. So One of the things we can do during a demand response time is, prior to that, it's usually 3 or 4 hours in one day, 5 or 6 times a year. So it's not like it's every day, and that would be a pretty weird experience, but we can make it cheaper if you show up earlier. And that actually has been shown to shift. Rideshare drivers particularly are very sensitive to pricing signals. So doing it that way and giving them a discount if they come at a different time of the day lets us shift a lot of demand to then say, okay, we know 21 hours ahead that this is happening. We're going to give people discounts if they show up before or after that time window when they're asking us to reduce power on the grid. So all of this stuff is early days, and we're testing it out. So I can't say it's going to work 100%, but this has to be the future of fast charging, or charging in urban environments. Because if you just said, just plug everything in, well, that's not going to work. I'm sorry. It's going to break the grid. So you have to have this interplay between energy and mobility, where the vehicles and individuals are able to respond to pricing signals that allow demand to be shifted around the grid. It's also spatial. So different parts of the grid are overloaded at different times. So maybe instead of saying, hey, no one can charge at 4 to 6 p.m. all across New York City, it's not. It's like, hey, this certain grid is overload 4 to 6. This one in Manhattan, by the way, is actually busiest during the middle of the day. So there's a lot of things you can do spatially in terms of locations, but also temporally with the time to shift demand around. And then the next step of that is just, instead of just like responding and slowing down chargers during certain times, it's how do we use vehicle to grid technology to actually take advantage of these, be a real asset to the grid, where we are injecting power back into the grid during those times.
And maybe there's no good way to answer this, but I'm curious about the kind of relative importance of those two. There's demand management, which you can do without really any particularly fancy vehicle to grid technology, which, as you say, is absolutely necessary for this to work at all. And then there's kind of the other half, which is vehicle to grid feeding power back in. Do you think those are both equally important? Because my sort of intuitive sense is that demand management is huge and foundational, whereas the vehicle to grid stuff is more of like maybe like a nice extra, but maybe you feel differently.
I think it's every kilowatt hour, whether you're taking it off demand or adding it to, is just as valuable. I think if you're a grid operator, it's why demand response programs are becoming more popular. So they're thinking of, instead of just ramping up power plants, just cut demand. It's the same thing. So number one, the integration between the chargers and the grid and having the grid signals allowed, that should be the number one priority because it's easiest to implement.
Yeah.
But let me give you some numbers here. So if there's 100,000 vehicles in New York City for Uber and Lyft, each one of those is 75 kilowatt hour battery packs. You're talking about 7.5 gigawatt hours of storage, which is crazy. And look, you're not going to use all of that at one time. That's not possible. But you can see the amount of energy rolling around.
Just for reference, like that's like comparable to the amount of grid storage, like extant in the country right now. Like these are huge numbers.
It's wild. And so we know the grid is getting more unstable over time.
Yeah.
And it's crazy not to take advantage of that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we need vehicles that are vehicle to grid capable. They don't exist.
True.
Outside of school buses. And the Nissan Leaf is no longer in existence. That's what we used at our first site. The vehicles, I think the chargers, and that's the easy part. The bidirectionality is a little harder with the utility, but that's probably more solvable if we can just get the vehicle manufacturers to make vehicle to grid capable cars. And you could imagine a world where rideshare drivers, it's like the gig economy. This is what I'm excited for. So if the vehicles exist and the charging stations exist that enable this, hey, instead of doing a ride, I'm going to go inject half my battery into the charging station here and get paid to do that. That sounds way better than driving around trying to get rides during those 4 or 5 days. So you could actually imagine this world where it's perfectly compatible with that type of driver lifestyle.
And you kind of have to imagine that at some point in the development of this market, some auto manufacturer is going to make a car that's designed to be a heavily used rideshare vehicle, that's like focused on resilience, vehicle to grid, like all this stuff you specifically need for rideshare vehicles. That's got to happen eventually, don't you think?
I'm surprised it hasn't. And maybe you call a Prius or a Camry designed for that already. But no, I really think it needs to happen, especially on the EV side.
Yeah.
And making it, we see a plethora of vehicles show up at our sites because one of the other things we do is we do both Tesla and CCS at all of our sites. So we have all the vehicle types, and there's some vehicles that are way less suitable for this use case and some that are way more suitable. And what you really want is a very fast charging vehicle that has a decent battery capacity to go through the whole day. And it's vehicle to grid capable, but it's beefy and it doesn't break when you hit a pothole.
Yeah.
And that, that's hard to find in the market right now. So drivers have a hard time choosing the right vehicle.
Yeah, it's not obvious. If you're a rideshare driver looking for an EV to use in your work, there's not really one obvious answer.
There really isn't.
I guess Tesla.
I mean, it's hard to not choose that given the charging network that exists.
Yeah, right.
But, when these 10,000 licenses came out or 12,000 licenses, most of the drivers went to whoever would give them a good financing deal.
Yeah.
So there was actually not a lot of thought, I don't think, put into what is the vehicle. So we have a lot of vehicles that show up. These are brand new cars that are out there that in the winter charge at 20 kilowatts. And that is crazy. So if you imagine trying to show up to a fast charging station and you only can charge at 20 kilowatts because it's cold, and those vehicles are not suitable for that use case at all, and these drivers have now paid for them. So I feel very bad for those drivers who are stuck with these vehicles where they have to spend 2 to 3 hours charging them every day. That's not going to work. So I hope people do more research when they're purchasing these vehicles for the use case, because they need a fast charging vehicle.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're running out of time. I do want to hit on a couple of environmental justice aspects. I think it's worth saying, because you haven't mentioned it yet, that your rideshare service, unlike Uber, employs its drivers as employees, right? Not gig workers, basically.
So I don't have all the answers here, but this is how we started the business. And this was originally, the reason we did it is we were starting this thing from scratch. So we had to provide a kind of alternative employment model for these drivers. And at first it was very popular, but I think we got to the point where we had a lot of driver feedback and had a hard time recruiting drivers under that employment model because they're so used to being independent contractors. So they don't like, as a W-2 employee, you got to show up and you can't be late and there's a rigid schedule. It's just different. As an independent contractor, you work when you want. And that was, we got to the point where we got big enough where we were having a hard time scaling under that model. So we've actually switched in the last few months to a independent contractor model. And again, it's not because we think it's, we're not the evil corporation. It simply comes back down to the drivers wanted that. And we've seen, pretty much all of our drivers switch over to that new employment model, and they've actually been pretty happy with it. And I think they make more money as well.
Oh, that's interesting. That's counterintuitive to me. But the other EJ thing is, and this connects with the rideshare thing, which I think is sort of a clever, it's just nice how it works out, which is that if you're focused on rideshare as your, as you say, anchor tenant, then you need to put your chargers basically where the rideshare drivers live. And unlike typical EV owners, right, which tend to be affluent and live in affluent areas, typical rideshare drivers tend to be lower income, working class, and live in working class areas. So if you go put the chargers where they live, you are also solving another persistent problem in this area, which is how to avoid this sort of spiraling inequality where you have to be rich to get the EV, and then you have access to chargers, but only if you're rich. And then, you know what I mean? The poor people get excluded from the whole thing. Was that planned, or is that like, did you just sort of discover at some point as you're thinking this through, like, oh, that's nice too?
I think the beautiful part of this is it's like, it's not we don't have to compromise on the financials to do that. So it's just a pure capitalistic play to put these chargers in that area because it actually makes money. And that's because the rideshare business is really cool. As if you think about the strategy of building chargers in areas where drivers live, well, that naturally tends to be, what is called an EJ community.
Yeah.
And we're doing that all across New York, San Francisco, LA. So I would say way over half of our sites are defined by the government, EJ communities. There's obviously different incentives and stuff that help there.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you get paid, or do you get incentives, government incentives, or special rebates or whatever for doing that?
Pretty much everything we're doing is state and local. And there are different state and local, like the Make Ready program, for example, has an adder if it's in a EJ community. But there's tax credits. There's a bunch of stuff around that now. But I wouldn't say that's like the main driver of our decision. We want to make this business work on its own, and putting chargers in like in the South Bronx, for example, we're building a site there because there's a lot of drivers. 25% of drivers live in the Bronx. So if you don't build any chargers in the Bronx, you're missing out on a big piece of the market. So this is something that is just naturally happening for us, and we're excited about it.
Are the mopeds still around? Are you still doing that?
So going back to what I said earlier, it's just not super scalable, really fun business, but in the end, we have to focus. So That was wound down at the end of last year. So no more mopeds, unfortunately. Very sad to see them go.
And nobody's taking that up or buying that from you or trying to make that work? The mopeds are just going to go away?
I don't think so. I mean, we had a lot of copycats when we were operating, but I'm not aware of anybody who is doing that now.
Yeah, hard to make that work. Okay, final question is, tell us a little bit about your expansion plans. So as I understand it, a lot of other, there's not a lot of people making the large investments in these fast charging locations because there's not demand yet. So your sort of trick here is by generating your own demand, you can go into a market that's fresh. You can go into any market and basically ladder yourself up. So is that the business plan, to go to new markets and gobble up the best public charger sites? Is that the expansion plan here?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Power is scarce.
Yeah.
So if you can find a good located site with access to power, that's going to be very valuable in the long run. Tons of times we're looking at locations and a whole neighborhood. 5 years. We have to put a new substation in. And that's going to get more and more difficult, not only because so many EVs are going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years, but also building electrification. So
yeah, everybody wants the electricity.
Yeah, electricity is like the new oil.
Yeah.
I like to think about in urban markets. Again, outside of urban markets, I don't know as much about it, but these urban markets that are really dense and have really dense grids, I mean, yeah, building a new substation in New York City is a really big project. So, and hard to get permitted and approved. So finding the locations where you can lock that power down and build charging stations and generate income off of that will be really valuable. So that's why our leases, when we do leases, are 30 years with options, So we're long-term in this business.
Interesting. And where is that? What is the, where are you coming? Right now, you've got sites built in New York City and a couple in San Francisco. Where are you now and where are you going?
Yeah, we're operating in New York City. That is going to be our biggest growth market still. It's the biggest opportunity for us.
Yeah.
Outside of New York City, we have leases signed in San Francisco, and we actually signed a lease in LA recently. So those are the next two markets. And then you can think about the largest, most dense urban markets in the country. After that, I can't share exactly which ones those are going to be, but it's not rocket science when you come and look at what these are.
Chicago, whatnot.
And then just specifically in New York, a couple sites I want to highlight. We are building a 60-stall site in Maspeth, Queens. It's going to have 400 kW charging. We have a 4.5 megawatt interconnection there. And we also have another one coming at LaGuardia Airport. Again, these are both about to open in a year. This is 48 stalls, are all 400 kW chargers, SK Signet chargers.
Can any vehicle charge at 400? Can any vehicle accept that?
I think some of the new Hyundais and Kias could get pretty close, or a Porsche. Again, we're not focused on the Porsche people, but some of the Hyundais and Kias can get there. And I think, everyone's moving to 800 volt architecture, which allows those really fast charge speeds. Like Tesla did that with the Cybertruck. So you can imagine this is going to happen with all the automakers.
Yeah.
So the speeds are going to increase, I think, exponentially. For the average speed right now is even at Tesla sites, it's 70 kW. So people think, oh, this is super fast. No, but we want to provide the super fast charging speeds while also doing the intelligent load management that we do to make sure that we're not putting a strain on the grid, so that people can show up, get fast charge speeds. The next person can show up, and then while that person's speed is slowing down naturally because their car doesn't charge at 400 the whole time, the other person gets 400. So the time you're at the site is little, but the impact on the grid is also small.
Yeah, I meant to ask, I assume you have a app or something that'll tell drivers what charging stalls are in use and which ones are free, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's actually pretty funny. We decided to launch this business with no app.
No app?
No app.
You're the only business left in America with no app.
It has treated us very well, where you show up and it's like a gas station. You swipe your credit card. There's never a problem, and you charge. It's simple. Don't have to explain to anyone. But we need to get more information in the hand of our drivers. So we just launched a new web app that allows us to do that. But we're going to continue to improve on that, and try to get something really, really, really intuitive that allows us to tell drivers, hey, we're doing demand response. Go to this site. and give different discounts different times and make this as good of an experience as possible. And again, one of the ways we're able to do that is because so many of our drivers are recurring customers.
Yeah,
so
right.
they might actually want to download an app, unlike someone who shows up to a site like, what, I have to download this app to use it once. These guys come here every day at our site. So they're super valuable customers to us, and we want to make sure they have as much information as possible.
Well, Tobias, this is all fascinating. Such a fascinating puzzle to solve. all this.
We're just one little piece of it, but we're trying.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think you're doing awesome work, and I think the main work you're doing is just like hacking through some of this fog and uncertainty and just answering some of these questions, just sort of demonstrating some of this stuff. I mean, a lot of it is just showing what can be done. Somebody's got to go first. So it's fascinating what you're doing. So thank you so much for coming on and talking through it with us.
Thanks, David. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes my guests and I sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.